Thank you all for joining us today, the folks who have been able to join live, as well as the folks who are joining us to watch this as the recorded session. Chris Marx is our faculty member that we'll be interviewing today. Dr. Chris Marx started as an associate professor in biological sciences at the University of Idaho in January of 2014. After double majoring in biology and environmental engineering at MIT and doing undergraduate research with Penny Chisholm, he earned his doctorate in microbiology at the University of Washington with Mary Lindstrom. His thesis work explored the physiological challenges of the unusual methanol-utilizing metabolism of methylobacterium. After becoming interested in evolutionary questions, he chose to pursue his NSF microbial biology postdoctoral fellowship at Michigan State University with Rich Lenski. Chris started his own group at Harvard University in 2005 in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. Although the systems are varied, the major theme of the lab's work has been to forego connections between underlying physiology and evolutionary and ecological outcomes, using mathematical models to generate quantitative, testable predictions. Okay, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your time to tell us a little bit about NIP Bio, your company that you've started. So I know that this is similar to, but it's distinct from your academic research in the university setting. So why don't you just kind of introduce us to what NIP Bio is all about?
Sure. So I'm a microbiologist. I've studied microbial physiology, evolution, ecology, things in that realm for a good number of years now, since start of graduate school. So 23 years of studying the same bug and whatnot. And through it, I've been interested in practical questions, but most of our actual research interests have hit more towards fundamental aspects of how bugs evolve, how they deal with having toxic intermediates, how they interact with each other in communities, things like that. And how NIPBio got started, back in 2013, I got an email out of the blue from someone whom I misread the email, actually. I was sufficiently busy. I thought he was still working at a biotech company, but unfortunately he was one of the 2/3 of the biotech company that was laid off on the same day, one of the cellulosic ethanol companies up in New Hampshire.
Oh, wow.
And was searching for like where cellulosic ethanol was kind of, it still kind of exists, but largely an area that was supported by subsidy and government research, but without really necessarily the next foot to stand on, which is why it hasn't really moved kind of as far. And so he was looking kind of where are areas that biotechnology with microbes really has a place, and thinking both about feedstocks, what you could give to them to make stuff, and then what is it that you want to make. And he realized that there's a lot of interest in quote C1 organisms that can use single carbon compounds. And so those can be relatively more oxidized things like CO2 or carbon monoxide. And there are some nice companies who are doing things like that with effluent coming out of smokestacks of various processes, but also more reduced C1 compounds like methane and methanol. And this is, it's an area where there's been biotechnological interest for decades. There's a fair amount of work around the kind of gas price crisis back in the late 70s, both in the States, in Europe, actually in particular in the former Soviet Union, around these sorts of things. And so he approached me and said, like, would you like to get a coffee sometime and talk about C1 biotechnology? And so I thought, I honestly thought to myself, well, fine, I'll go get a coffee with you. You want to learn more, then have me come up for a day. I certainly wouldn't mind, a day's worth of reimbursement. I had once done that before and allowed me to pay down my credit cards. So I figured, oh, but fine, I'll start off with a coffee. And then I met Larry Feinberg at a coffee shop appropriately named for an evolutionary biologist like myself called Darwin's. And we sat down and, I got the story correct. He started asking me questions about what would you want to make, what bug would you want to use, etc. And I started outlining that of these organisms, methane is what you get directly from natural gas, but as most people know, it's pretty explosive, and it turns out that creates kind of process issues. It's because it's an explosive gas. It's very low solubility in liquid, so it's hard to supply it fast enough. Those organisms have an exceptionally high oxygen demand, all these various things. And the bugs that do that are just not very well understood compared to bugs like the one I've been working on for a while that eats methanol, and had been more kind of the E. coli of this whole type of physiology because it's just so much easier to work with. So I said, it's not like it's necessarily the fastest, but it's just so much better understood that if we wanted to actually make any kind of advanced product, this would be the beachhead for such things. And then, in terms of what sorts of products, I knew that our bugs actually have a little jar. So this is a whole bunch of dried bacteria in it.
Okay.
And as you can tell, it's pink. It looks like
yeah.
powder. And so the color are carotenoid compounds. And so the same sorts of things that are in carrots, these long, optically interesting conjugated molecules, and they're relatively high value. And I knew that there was an interest in aquaculture, that for salmon, the astaxanthin that they need to consume so that salmon looks like salmon and doesn't look like, catfish or something like that. It was an important and high value molecule. And that there was also interest in these group of organisms as single cell protein, as a nutritional source. And this was a time when so many biotechs had kind of come up and then fell back down because they promised the sun and the moon. I was trying to think of like, what's something that's actually closer to feasible? And the thought that we could kind of retune the carotenoids towards what's needed in aquaculture, and we don't even need to extract them. No harsh organic solvents. You can just put this into the pellets. Like here's some shrimp pellets, little tiny things that would go in there, and then it would both be a little bit of a protein source, but also be a source of higher value products. And with the idea, like even from that day one, that we kind of thought of it like, McDonald's sells burgers at nearly cost. And where do they make their money? People who buy Coca-Cola and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And so the molecules kind of come for free on the ride. They would drive the value proposition. And as long as we could make the single cell protein at somewhere even near cost, then the scenario would work. And
very, very cool. So I imagine you guys had to do a bunch of testing and a bunch of intensive research to figure out a stable formulation to get the bacteria to produce exactly what you wanted to produce at the right quality and quantity. So where are you in your kind of operation now? You're no longer just in the lab. Where are you today?
Yeah, so it really fairly quickly, basically instantly came out of the lab. We had one particular kind of founding piece of IP in the lab. And that was kind of what we first kind of hung our hat on, a way that at least presented an opportunity for kind of higher yield, more cell material based upon the same amount of methanol. And to be honest, like that's not the direction things have ended up going. But just like in academic science, certainly there can be pivots. And so even though broadly speaking, we are still all about aquaculture, like that part has kind of has pivoted. And we have successfully made strains that make all sorts of different carotenoids, astaxanthin, beta carotene, all sorts of beautiful bright reds, bright oranges, yellows, etc. So that's come along fairly well. But we first needed to move kind of out of the lab. So that first one was licensed from Harvard, where I was faculty for about 9 years before moving to University of Idaho. But it became really clear that if we wanted to, as a company, actually own the IP around any further developments, it can't be made on the sacred ground of Harvard University. And so thus we moved out and literally into Larry's chicken barn out about 30 miles west of campus. And our first batch of bacteria grown up for this purpose was in a trash can. We couldn't really normally, like I would use an autoclave and at high pressure and rather high temperatures sterilize media. We instead went to Costco and got a coffee maker carafe thing. And so we figured 70 Celsius is about as good as we're gonna be able to do. That'll at least kill most things, though not all. And went to a place that sells methanol to people who soup up their race cars and mixed up the batch. And then of course, normally these are aerobes. They need to be well stirred, and we do it in little tiny flasks that go shaky, 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 not in a static 40-gallon thing. And so we got some aquarium pumps. I mean, it was pathetic in terms of certainly far from optimal conditions. We grow it up, it's nice and pink. We have no centrifuge. Like, how can you centrifuge a trash can worth of liquid? I mean, I couldn't even do that in lab. They have these fancy continuous flow centrifugation systems to do this in a real production facility. And so, turning to my love of beer, I went to a homebrew store and found I knew that there were fining agents, things that make yeast fall out of solution. And so I got one of everything, set up some tubes, and thank goodness one of them caused it to crash out. And it's actually it's colloidal chitin. And so it's like ground up little tiny shrimp shells. So we figured if we need it to fish anyways, let's go for it, which is a good thing, because by the time it settled out and later we did elemental analysis, it was about 40% shrimp shells and 60% bacteria. So it certainly was not ideal.
Yeah.
But we did our first little trial with some folks at Roger Williams University near there, literally with clownfish, because we had so little material that they had like little, almost like a Play-Doh maker to take our half a kilogram of cell material, mix it into their normal formulation alongside a control, and see, do the fish grow? Because you can have all these nice ideas, but in this case, the fish to some extent is the customer, and you don't know necessarily, will they eat it?
Yeah.
Will it cause them to go belly up? What, how are things going to go? And thankfully, it worked well. And so we've kind of just bootstrapped up towards larger and larger levels. Now we do production via contract manufacturing, and so these are like pretty good size fermentation containers. If you've been to a brewery, like a pretty good, not maybe Budweiser, but a pretty good sized brewery container, and we can get about 3/4 of a ton of dried from that, which is actually just a phenomenal amount of cells. So it can, one of the things that I knew about it is that there had been a history of growth to industrial levels. So I knew it could be done if we had kind of a path. And so right now, that's where production is working. We have done testing has really, the interface between microbial biomass and fish biology has really been the major hurdle and the major thing to understand, and thankfully through a series of partnerships, and then ultimately moving out to like smaller farmers in Western Massachusetts, because the company's still in the Boston area, got things started, and things were going really well. And we had kind of another pivot because of it, which has become our saving grace, especially through COVID, which is we could feed them, the fish were doing well, good conversion into biomass, all these things. And Larry would tell me, I think the fish taste better. And I thought, my co-founder is fantastic, but he's pretty optimistic. And I thought, well, I'm sure it does. And we had done shrimp trials before, and he's like, I think they taste better. I'm sure they do. And indeed, they do. Like we had professional chefs for some of these events, and they were making the same comments. So we took some of the fillets and did an analysis, and there was a dramatic reduction in some of the off flavors that accumulate in fish. And so suddenly we had a solution for one of the biggest problems in a different market than we'd originally intended. Rather than out at sea aquaculture in large pens, there's been a huge push towards recirculating aquaculture systems that are grown on land. The ecological footprint is so much lower. There's no release of either fish or nutrients into the environment, and it can finally be done at a good scale. But this is recirculating aquaculture system. Of course, fish do what everything else does. They poo, and that needs to be recirculated through. And the thought had been for a long time that it's because of the biofilters just aren't perfect, and it has these other particular molecules that come through that give it just a bit of a musty flavor. And it's kind of what makes tilapia and things like that taste kind of sometimes a bit, or catfish, a bit on that muddy side of things. But you don't want your salmon, your sushi grade salmon and things like that to taste. And this is like one of the big issues, and there's a ton of capital going into this. And it had always been thought that it was the water system, but we had control experiments, exact same water, 2 different feeds. Our fish taste better, and
Wow.
they have lower molecules by a substantial amount. And so that, pivot again, like that, even before the color, like we'll get to the color later, but we need to make a beachhead on a product to be able to kind of pull through and make this happen. And we've got both like the feed companies and the farms kind of on board. And so hopefully in the very near future, we'll be producing at an even larger scale and beginning to get rolling on that.
So that's great. So you're selling, you've got customers, you've got not only customers, you've got feedback from those customers that have provided you with the ability to pivot in a different direction. And that's really an exciting stage to be at in a company where you guys are growing, because those things can start to snowball on one another and start to fund other experimental ventures as you guys continue. So talk to me a little bit about, we talk about approvals and approvals required for commercialization of different products all the time. I mean, and even my employee gave the great example, even a ladder, requires OSHA approvals and stuff. You think you go up a ladder, how much different could it be from ladder to ladder? That requires all this regulatory approval. So is there a regulatory approval path for your product? What has that been like? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Oh yes. No, there definitely is. It's really ironic. We feed microbes to animals all the time. Corn stover and things like that. That is, old, musty, fermented, straw, so that it becomes, more microbial biomass. We feed all sorts of things, of course, but because they're not pure, you don't know what's actually there. It's all good. There's basically nothing besides nutritional yeast that has had approval as a feed ingredient in animals. And strangely, though, you'd be allowed to use it as a feed ingredient for humans. And so if we wanted to make, a pink impossible burger, that's fine because it's not your entire diet and you have choice. And the fish don't have choice and it's their entire diet. And so there are literally no other bacteria in that. And so we went through this process and we started that. I would think that was one of the very first things we got going on, probably back even in 2014 or 15 or something. And I think it was maybe about a year and a half ago, we finally got approval. And we're like the first one through a very long pipeline. And that was pre-COVID staffing and things like that. So it is a tremendous hurdle, and it was awful for us, but like it's going to be awful for anybody else who wants to bring their product through. And I get it. I think there certainly one a company should take responsibility over: is my product safe?
Mm-hmm.
Is just as one might imagine, like you're saying about the ladders. The process is not exactly efficient, and I get that it's hard, but it's certainly. You'd feel like this could be a little smoother of a path.
So were you guys USDA? Were you FDA? Were you EPA? Were you all of those?
This is B.
Put you on the spot.
USDA. Yeah, and so we have GRAS approval, generally regarded as safe. And the nice thing is, for many other jurisdictions, like USDA, U.S. approval will count just fine. Some jurisdictions in the world have their own process, but it's much lower bar, and other places are more time consuming and rigorous. We're going through this right now with Canada, for example, which largely takes our multi-100-page dossier and goes forward with it, but then asks additional questions, etc.
Well, congratulations. That's a huge stamp of approval to get GRAS certification. That's congratulations.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's certainly not one of those things that we thought this was going to be, a big flag, but just something that you have to do. But it's hard, and it covers this initial organism and process and things that are essential sameness. As long as it's essentially the same, it also has approval. But of course, that what's essentially the same. That's a very squishy definition. But at least, even let's say we go forward with a carotenoid product, we would have to go forward, and because it's a color additive, now we're making a statement about efficacy. It's not just in there. That goes through another process. But at least, like with the beachhead of having this through. Now you're just adding to it.
Yeah.
It's not that it's fun, but at least, the first major hurdle is in place.
So that's different from your work in an academic lab. You never had to go through commercial certification for a new product or a new. Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about how else, running your lab has been different inside the university versus kind of running the company or working in the company outside the university.
Yeah, no, there's certainly, I mean, I guess they're both different and not. So when we got this started and we kind of got our first angel checks in hand and incorporated and whatnot, Larry was ready to jump into this full on, and I still wanted to be a professor. I want to be involved. I want to see this make it. And so, I am, kind of the weird, the hybrid entrepreneur, you could say, where this is my my sidecar to the majority of my life. But it isn't for him, right? I mean, certainly somebody better take it on full. And so we, did things that way, and in terms of something to think about for other people in my shoes, like we thought about then how the founders shares should reflect that asymmetry. And I've been a board member through this funding round that we're about to open. Probably some of the new folks coming in will probably replace me on the board, but it's not just money. I think it's really smart money in terms of people who have the connections and the experience that we need to make this work. And so I would say the financial side is really very, very different. There's so many parts to a business that don't really have a clear analog, because it's not, for most labs at least, it's just you and then the funding agencies in terms of how you get your money.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't all these kind of highly varied things. And then once you get your money, it's not like they've got pieces of some cap table and things like, so it's a different kind of game. On the other hand, it made me realize a lab is basically just a permanent startup. You're always going for your next funding round and you just never have revenue. And so like you just constantly keep repitching and repitching and repitching, new things. So I would say that side is quite different. And surprisingly, as much scientific writing as I've been involved in, I can barely understand our own patents. Like patents are just
a different language almost.
Oh my God, it kills me. It feels like you took, and people make fun of scientists maybe for not being the most eloquent in communication. We can say something in 6 pages and have it make sense, instead of, it feels like it just gets exploded into 600 pages of a very different architecture, which I know has its purpose, but it's really hard. It is not something that's easy at all, I think, for an academic to realize, what did you do to my science to turn it into this? And unfortunately, and then like by the time, it also, like, it gets published, but it's not really yet real, because then it goes to the patent office, and then years later things get struck down, etc. In a way that there's not really an academic analog, and it's really can be depressing at times, where you end up getting stuck, make these series of claims from like, there's no way you could take this away from me, to here's a broad one that probably won't stick, but let's try. And like these series, right, of staggered claims, and it certainly left us wondering at times, why did advise to go in this path or that path? That part's hard.
Yeah, it really is, and it's, thank you for sharing your experience there, because that can be a huge, it can be a big blow to people kind of personally, and having to go through and really cut it, because you're trying to exactly what you said, start with the world and then work with the patent office to get down to only and exactly what you can really claim as new. And it is a tedious process. So I commend you for sticking with it.
Yeah. And then of course there's the balance, which is a little bit different again from the academic world generally, in terms of what do you move forward to patent versus what do you just hold on to as kind of, this is this special sauce that makes our bugs grow well, where it may not be sufficiently different, sufficiently novel to even earn a patent. By the time you put it out there, then it's something that others could latch on to. And so there's some stuff that just doesn't make sense to share. And it's a bit fortunate, but I think, it's the reality of a competitive landscape. And at least most of the time in the academic world, those sorts of things, the vast majority of time, I think, are relatively more freely shared. If somebody asks me, how do you make this happen? Even if they're, a competitor, though I don't really feel like I have competitors academically, in nearly the same way, at least in the field of work that I'm in. That's also kind of, a different side to things.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, we're about at our time. And so if you had one thing to say to faculty members or to graduate students or even undergraduate students who are listening in today, what would you tell them about entrepreneurship? What advice would you leave them with?
I guess I would say, on one hand, I think it's been really fun. It's exciting. I kind of went into science wanting to do something useful, something that had some environmental import, and it got sucked into kind of particular intellectual questions. And it wasn't until much later that suddenly we're back to something that actually could be really helpful, and being able to feed the world in a way that's sustainable. Like our food system uses something like 30 or 40% of our total energy, and fish are way more efficient than beef, etc. It's fun. Like it's actually kind of it's created that kind of path, and so it feels really valuable. And I'd love to see this win, not just for the financial stability of my family, but also like this kind of thing deserves to make it. And the flip side, I would say, is, God damn it, get some advice, because it's like it's hard. There's so many steps in the process that just don't aren't intuitive and don't follow the kind of normal academic track in terms of like how things are communicated, knowing when, like if you're on the edge of a patent, what things you should or should not be saying at a conference right before you file a patent, these sorts of advice. So people like your office, I think really going there, and then if you do start a company, having good advisors and consultants, etc., to lead through the manifold directions that one has to think about.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today to do this interview and this recording. And please, those of you who are on the call, stick around and we'll do live Q&A following the conclusion of this interview. So thanks again so much for your time, Chris.
You bet.
So thank you guys for attending. We have a question in the chat box that we'll lead off with right away. Vikas Kumar, thank you for submitting your question. Vikas writes, it's a great journey and interesting. Being a fish nutritionist from Aquaculture Research Institute, I'm aware about your great product for the aquafeed industry. I thought it is a protein source. Does your product also affect the lipid metabolism and fillet quality of fish, especially in salmon or trout?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've worked with the ARI. We've got a publication that starts off with Ron Hardy as the first author. So you can't do better than that, I think, in your field. Lipids, I would say this particular bacteria, and actually a lot of bacteria, tend to be relatively low lipids compared to other things. There are some yeast products out there that have much higher lipids. There's just so much more intracellular membranes in, say, a yeast cell compared to a bacterial cell, that most of the bacteria are relatively low on lipids. And they certainly don't have the fish oils naturally, the omega-3 fatty acids and things like that. But there are some kind of analogous business model yeasts that have been designed to make fish oils in their membranes that can supply that really well. And so I think the basic business model, could you use a single cell organism to supply that really key piece of what is needed to grow fish, is absolutely possible. And I think combining some various microbial products together with their separate benefits would be a great way to go. But that's probably not ever, frankly, that this particular bacteria is going to be good at. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that response. I see we've got some of your colleagues on the line here. Brian Small is on the line. And we've got Ina Popova on the line as well. James Van Leeuwen, we've got people from all sorts of different areas. Paul Rowley, also another microbial researcher. So come on, you guys. I know you guys have got some questions for Chris about his startup company.
Hi, Chris, it's Paul.
Hey.
I missed the first few minutes of the talk, of the interview, but could you just speak to more about how you sort of crossed the valley of death between you know, doing fermentation in a trash can to, you know, getting sufficient quantity to actually test on a larger scale? I felt there was a bit of a jump there, and it's a critical point for commercialization that is known to be a major stumbling block for a lot of products.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the trash can was run only for that first test with the fish, and really, you know, as I was trying to say, that allowed us to bring in a little bit more money. And one of the things we did, we've done a lot of partnerships, and so we've taken a relatively lean entrepreneurial path, partly by design, partly, of course, is if you can work with as much money as you're able to bring in. So if you bring in a modest amount, you find a way to make a modest amount work. And one way is to use partnerships. And so for the production side, I had other colleagues I knew actually up at a NRC research center in Quebec, in Montreal area, that had worked on this organism and culturing it with a totally different purpose to try to have it produce PHB and extract that. It's a biodegradable plastic. So they had experience working with this bug. And so we were able to go there, and they've got this kind of research facility. It's kind of in between what a little lab would have and a real production facility, that they've got, you know, this size vessel and this size vessel and a room size vessel, and then like big ones, etc. And so we could try out some things there at, you know, 20 liters, and then step it up to 300 liters, and then step that up to 5,000 liters, and that kind of work, and deal with some of the, you know, initial warts of the process. How do you make sure that you're not supplying so much substrate that it's toxic? We had to worry about things like anti-foam, that as they get growing up, it just gets really foamy kind of thing. So you can add particular food grade anti-foams to kind of keep that down, or you can add extra pressure to the vessel, you know, various sorts of stuff. And so kind of working out some of those details. And then thankfully, by the time we use that to make a little bit bigger batches that we could use for slightly bigger fish trials and shrimp trials and things like that. And by the time we needed larger amounts, we were able to take essentially the protocol from Canada, and instead down at a production facility in Mexico, able to grow at a pretty decent scale. So yeah, you know, in this case, luckily, I knew that there was a path where they had some experience with our particular bug, since it's not exactly normal.
So I guess, sorry, not to monopolize your time, but I guess the one thing that I would like to know is, then you made that contact initially because you were aware of the work.
Yeah.
I mean, was that done for free, or did they take some cut of the IP for doing that work for you? Because I know that pre-product development like that, especially fermentation, it can be, I mean, I've had quotations for what we're doing of hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that kind of product development.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, what was their angle for letting you play around?
It was, so they're, you know, so they're a Canadian research institute. So they're a nonprofit, but it doesn't feel like it when they send you the bill. Like it's still really expensive. So it might be like half of what a for-profit might charge you at that scale, but it's still, it was pricey. And because they are trying to bring in that kind of work, you know, they could do something like delayed payment sort of things, you know, so it was better. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It is crazy how expensive and inefficient from a per, you know, kilo of stuff it is at the beginning. But you just have to know that there is no other path. It will, those first batches will absolutely not be economically viable unless your stuff is just worth a mint. And
I thought you had sort of a magic formula, so it doesn't change. That's fair enough. Thank you, Chris.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, even now, at the scale that we're doing, it's big. It still costs us more to make than what we can sell it for right now, because we don't own it, right? And so, I mean, so it means the business to be in is like start a contract manufacturing facility. And as long as you do a good job, then you can be the one that charges a lot of people a lot of money to, you know, and there's certainly a need for it. It's really hard. They're usually quite busy. And so it's, the market forces are such that they, we need it as a step up, but it's costly.
So I have a related or follow-up question. How did you find those contract manufacturers that you had confidence in, or how did you build confidence in them? Especially you've got somebody in Canada, you've got somebody in Mexico, you're trying to work across the borders, you're trying to protect your IP. How did you develop those partnerships, and was that difficult?
So a lot of this, the credit goes to Larry. I mean, he just made an infinite number of phone calls through time to various sorts of folks, and so some. Like I said, I knew the people up in Canada, and that's what got us rolling there. But he, found lots of different ventures, and I would say it's certainly a scenario, whether it's for funding or whether it's something like this, where it may take 200 first calls to have 20 actual conversations, to have 3 or 4 that get considered seriously, and then maybe one of those actually becomes a something. And so like my call to Canada was the opposite. I knew him. It was one call. It worked. But that's been relatively unusual at all of the other stages of things. That there's just a lot of dead ends that end up happening. It's hard to make kind of all the pieces match up.
And so does Larry work full time in the company, or what is his level of wow? Okay, yeah. So that makes a huge difference, right?
Yeah, I mean, ever since we started, he's been 100% on board. So he's our CEO and co-founder. And so certainly, I would say for most such things, building this kind of business, somebody has to really, have the bull by the horns. It's hard to do in just a few hours on the weekend. It's not really going to push this kind of a business forward. But in this case, as the academic part of it, it doesn't necessarily mean that I had to quit my job. We had people tell me, "Oh no, if you don't quit your job, this company will never make it." Sorry, like that's not what I'm looking for in life. And so like that wasn't going to be what it was from the start. But I think if both Larry and I were academics and not in it, then I don't think it would have moved in this particular case.
Well, I think that's a great lesson about the need to partner with somebody who can really dive in and, like you said, take the wheel and help drive the business to success. It's great. Any other questions from folks on the line?
Hey, Chris, I would have liked to see you strap that garbage can to a carousel or something.
Say it again?
Yeah, I would have liked to see that garbage can strapped to a carousel or something. So I had 2 kind of questions. One has to do with, and maybe I missed this in the beginning, whether or not the microbe is an environmental isolate versus like the differences between using a bacteria that lives, or any microbe that is in the environment, versus one that has been evolved versus one that has been engineered. And if there's, in this industry, if those are different, and the differences between using those 3 different categories of microbes. And then the other question was more about lessons learned in industry carrying over to academia, and vice versa. What are the coolest things you've learned?
Yeah, so I'll ignore the trash cans and carousel question. But so in terms of like what microbes can be utilized, I'd say it somewhat depends upon the jurisdiction, where, how feasible different scenarios are as you move towards, something that's highly genetically modified, and that's just, the third rail and you can't touch it, versus it being much less so. Things that are evolved, or even like the traditional strain development sort of stuff, they would just like either use nasty chemical mutagens or UV light and mutagenize the crap out of an organism and then select for given traits. So there's zillions of mutations and rearrangements and all sorts of stuff. You have no idea what's going on, but you get your traits and it's natural. And ironically, if we use, like a genetic technique so that we make a single nucleotide change in the genome, but we did it on purpose, my bug's a GMO and the other one isn't, right? With it's it's not even about the end product. It's about like what type of hammer you use to make the end product. And that's the part that drives me insane, like just insane. Yes, you should demonstrate something safe, but how you got to an endpoint shouldn't matter. It should matter what's the endpoint, and is it or is it not safe? And I mean, and unfortunately, it's the kind of thing where you can have National Academy of Science and others have put out reports saying GMOs, no evidence, none of problems, writ large at all, and it's it's a faith-based rather than a fact-based challenge. And so in some places like in Europe, it would be more of a problem, but even they have allowed like the yeast that makes omega-3 fatty acids into salmon, that's allowable. And the thing is, it's often just very inconsistent. They use all sorts of U.S. corn and U.S. soy in Europe. That stuff's 99.9% GMO. It's like, give me it's not, so it's frustrating because it can cause problems in some areas, in some places. And so there ends up being shades of gray in terms of like at least where we're at right now, where like the strain that we're using, it's only missing certain genes. There's nothing else been added. And so in most places, that's fine. And there's no antibiotic resistances and et cetera. And so like that's okay. But even still, like it's a little, all right, you got to tell us everything you know about how what you did there, et cetera. In a way that if it was just a natural strain or something that we mutagenize the crap out of it would be okay. So it really depends upon where you are. And in this case, like that flower, it's dead. Like it's not even a live organism. It's, it's a little bit illogical at times. And then your other question was kind of how has being involved with this changed the way I approach the academic world?
Yeah, I think so.
You think so? Okay. Is that right? Or was it slightly different than that?
Yeah, that's right, Chris. I'm looking for good ideas, things that academics, don't think of that maybe you've seen, cool lessons you've carried over.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there are some good lessons to think. I think to some extent, one of the things I think a lot of us academics most enjoy is the freedom to do X, Y, and Z and go in all these different directions, and because nobody's right on our back in terms of what is it you're doing and will this be worthwhile, et cetera. And even if the worthwhile isn't like what it does to the bottom line, like I would say there are times when we can, I think in labs, we can end up being a little bit laissez-faire about, well, this is interesting and this is interesting and this is interesting. But the problem is everything in the world is interesting. Like what's actually interesting enough to really concentrate time on? And so I think in terms of trying to decide, should we even go down a given path, or we've got these 5 different paths open, which of these really makes sense, either at the level of a lab, but really, I think this challenge comes more often like at the level of any given grad student or postdoc, et cetera, kind of like how to evaluate the portfolio of things that you're doing and what's the rationale, like why you only have so much time, you want to graduate in whatever, say 2 or 3 years, what should you really be pushing on that's going to be most worthwhile and also brings the most joy to you, et cetera. But kind of that sort of evaluation, I think we can sometimes be a little bit lax on, because it's fun to look at new things and there isn't anybody kind of overlooking us in the same sort of way. That and then just at a very practical level, our director of research was just very, very much better at organizing information in the lab, all the notebooks, all the everything. Like it just had that shit together in a way that, unfortunately, I would say I have not done as nearly as good of a job with in the lab. And I'm trying to move in that kind of direction, but just really treating it more professional. And that I don't think being more professional doesn't have to be less fun, but it does take time to just really keep things in a row. So those would be maybe things that I've learned trying to bring back to the lab.
Thanks.
In the chat box, I put a link to an article I came across recently titled 10 Simple Rules to Commercialize Scientific Research. And I put that in there because the first rule is what drives science does not drive business, right? And so that touches on your point, Chris, of exploring everything that's interesting in the academic lab as a luxury that often you can't afford in the business setting. So thank you for that. I have a quick question. Have you guys developed any trademarks around your product lineup?
Yeah, we do have various phrases and insignias and things like that that we have certainly gone for. So probably a dozen or so. I'm not even sure exactly how many such things, but that's certainly been, you know, a part of it. I don't think it's a major part, and I don't think it's a major part because we're a little bit buried inside. It's more like you know, I think sometimes the producer would actually want to advertise just like a computer, you know, Intel inside kind of thing. Like this could be, you know, fish food from X company with Knit Bio inside kind of thing. But we are not directly selling to a farm, and we certainly aren't selling directly to customers in, you know, Whole Foods. And so because there's multiple chains, that like you know, it's more B2B, you know, business to business communication rather than to consumer that matters. So we haven't put as much in that direction.
Sure.
Even though it matters, the whole consumer acceptability, et cetera, that drives the whole field, I think. It's not, we want to be a part of that conversation, but we certainly can't be the lead driver. That's a good question.
Great. Well, thank you guys. We've got about 10 minutes left. There's a little bit room for more questions if you have any further questions, you guys. Well, hearing none, we'll go ahead and close out the call. Chris, thank you so much for your time, and participants, thank you so much for your thoughtful interaction today. These conversations are always stimulating, and they can open up new directions for all sorts of people who are interested in commercializing their scientific research. Next month, we will be hearing from a business owner who partnered with Dr. Shelley McGuire here at the University of Idaho. And her name is Trill Paulin, and she'll be talking about her company that's called Free to Feed and their breast milk test strip product that will be rolling out soon to help mothers isolate food allergies in their infants. So please join us then, and we'll hear from a totally different perspective in this series, Startup Stories, Conversations with Entrepreneurs and Researchers. So thanks everybody, and Chris, especially thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much.